You're watching the free version of this tutorial. Upgrade to premium for all footage and projects and exclusive content. Hello again, and as promised, in this exercise we're going to be looking a bit more at the track parameters. So we'll be going a bit more in depth about how we can get the most suitable tracking for a particular object or a particular circumstance. Here we have a little look through our footage now. This is a little bit different than some of the other stuff we've been working in, because I just want to illustrate some of the concepts and ideas, and I think that having something that is just simple and not distracting is going to be the best way to go about it. So the first thing we're going to look at is this box in the top left-hand corner. And what I'm going to do is I'm just going to stop that around about there before any of our other boxes come up. So if you do only want to focus on a small piece of a longer clip, you can do that very easily in the viewer controls down at the bottom here. At the moment we can see our project in point, our project out point, and the current frame. And to the left and right of the current frame counter, we have set in points and reset in point, reset out point, and set out point. So if I set my out point now, you'll be able to see that my out point is now set to frame 125. And we can still view the rest of the timeline at the moment, but if we wanted to focus just on these first 126 frames, what we do is we would use this button to zoom in to our in and out points. This would then zoom the timeline in to our in and out points. And we could always come back just by clicking on the button to the right of it, which would zoom us back out to the full length of the clip. And as you can now see, we have our project in point and our project out point marked very nicely and conspicuously with red brackets. Let's zoom back in again and take a look at our first box. And we're just going to track this. So let's come up and make our first shape. So come to our X-spline tool and just go 1, 2, 3, 4, right click. There we go. And let's turn off our transform box because we don't need that right now. If I wanted to, I could sharpen up these points as well, because at the moment these are X-splines. I will be going more in depth about X-spline controls when we come to rotoscoping, but just for now, we can use the control handle here to soften or sharpen the movement around these points. And if I wanted to make sharp edges across the entire spline, I can just right click and then I can affect all of the points simultaneously. All right, so we have now our first spline shape, and I will call this one position. And let's come down and dig into the track parameters. So we've looked at the input, we're choosing what clip we're working with. We've looked at pre-processing with the input channel and the minimum percentage of pixel used and smoothing level. What we haven't looked at is what's going on in the rest of the parameters. So if we look at motion first, we can determine what sort of motion we're looking to track. And if I turn all of these off here, are we just looking for translation, which is just going to track in translation data, so position data, X and Y. Let's track that forwards and see what that looks like. That's looking quite nice. And as it starts rotating around, well, you can see that we still were able to track the position quite nicely, quite handily, but it didn't do rotation for us. But as the object starts to rotate around, our spline does not. So it's literally just only translating position. Okay, let's turn the visibility off on that. And let's make another shape roughly the same. Turn off the transform again. There we go. So this works down as a hierarchy. If we also want to bring in scale, we can click scale on as well. Scale's not really going to help us because this object isn't scaling up. It's going to be rotating around. So we also want to turn rotation on. But we can't just track translation and rotation. This works in a hierarchy, so as soon as we click on rotation, it's going to bring scale in for us as well. But that's not a big issue, and it's kind of what we want anyway. So let's rename this in the layer controls as rotation, and let's just track that forwards. And this is going to do the same sort of thing as it's moving around. It's going to track in the position, but as it rotates this time, it's also going to follow along with the rotation. Very nice. Okay, very good. Let's come in now and I'll do one more shape on this one here. And we'll call this one small motion. And to come down to the motion parameters again, turn off the shear and look over to the right hand side where we have the choice of large motion, small motion, or manual track. Now Mocha defaults to large motion when it's doing a track. So what this means is when it's tracking, it's searching for the motion and then optimizes the track as it goes. So it corrects for drift and all that sort of fun stuff. Basically doing all the good stuff that gets the track nice and solid. When we have small motion turned on, this doesn't do the search. This just optimizes the track. And let's see what that does in practice. Let's turn our track on, and what we get very quickly and very loudly is a little window coming up saying tracking terminated prematurely. One or more selections were not tracked properly. And this means, simply speaking, that it wasn't able to find that original clip anymore once it moves past there. It can't find our shape anymore and it can't track it. So why would you use small motion? Well, small motion is great when all you're trying to do is just identify, well, small motion. So little bits of camera jitter or camera judder, for example, which would count as motion that is small enough for small motion to work with. And you turn that on to reduce the possibility of Mocha getting distracted by anything else that's going on in the image. But for anything that's moving, as indeed this one is, small motion just isn't going to cut it. You do need to have that search going on. And manual track, surprisingly enough, this lets you track in stuff manually without using the tracker at all. And we'll see an example of this later in the course. Cool, so let's come back now one more time and make another shape here. I do love this shape, obviously. And back down to our parameters, turn the shear off. So we're only tracking translation, scale, and rotation. Keep large motion on. And let's look at where it's searching for with this large motion. We come over to the right now, we have a search area. And at the moment, this is set to auto. So this is the distance in pixels that the tracker is going to be looking for to find the object in the next frame or previous frame, depending on which way you're tracking, obviously. Now, if you've got big movements and the tracker isn't following along with them enough, you might want to come in and turn this value up slightly to tell Mocha to look further and wider for your object. Alternatively, if it's getting confused by something else and moving a little bit too far, we can also turn that down as well to limit the search area to a slightly more constrained range. In the majority of cases, though, auto is going to be absolutely fine. Well, let's just delete this shape and have a look at the next bit of the clip, shall we? So with this layer selected, going to come down to my layer controls and just hit the delete button there, and that just gets rid of it for me. Fantastic. Okay, now let's come to the bottom of the viewer, open that back up one more time, and reset our out point. So that was at 125. Let's come up to 126 now. Set a new in point and come over here. And get it to where the movement stops on this one, which is frame 267. Okay, so we'll set our out point there, and let's just zoom into that now. And let's just focus on the one in the top right. And let's find a good frame for us to track it. So I want to find a frame where we can see it the most clearly. So with something nice and sharp. So here, frame 164 is looking pretty good. Come over and create a nice new X-spline. Right click to close it off and right click on the control handle and just get that a little bit sharper. Turn off the transform tool and zoom in a little bit so we can see this a bit clearer. And what I want to do is 3 different versions of this same shape. So I'm going to say, so I'm going to call this one auto. I'm going to make another copy of it. Again, in the layer controls, just come down to the bottom, and just click on the second button here, which duplicates the layer, and I'm going to duplicate that one more time, and I'll call this one angle, and I'll call this one zoom. And let's turn visibility and processing off on all of these and drag them down to the bottom, because we don't want those layers interfering with our track on this one here, which it will do if they're above the layer we're tracking. More on that later. And let's set our parameters again. So come down to translation, scale, and rotation. Boom. We'll keep the rotation on. We don't want shear. And let's move back to the search area. So we've looked at the horizontal and vertical. We haven't looked at angle and zoom percentage. So what we can do with these is we can set a maximum value that they're going to change between frames. With zoom, it's set in percentage, and with angle, it's set in degrees. So we'll leave these both at 0 and 0 and just track this through using the default settings. Okay, well, that's pretty good-ish. Let's have a little look, track that backwards again. And tracking prematurely terminated, because as we go further back, it's going to get a little bit too small for us. All right, let's pop to our keyframe here and just quickly open up our surface here. So they're pretty much on the corner points, and it's sticking well during the first bit of slow rotation, as you can see. But as the rotation gets faster, it's not able to keep up. So it fails and then just eventually just gives up. And the same for the scaling. It just sort of, has to give up at some point. Let's try and do that same thing. And the only thing we're going to change, we'll come to angle. Let's bring this one up now. Turn visibility and processing on this. Turn our surface off. The only thing we're going to change, we can do everything exactly the same. Only thing we're going to change is the angle here. And we can be keyframing this, but let's just crank our angle up to 12 degrees. And let's just track this forwards. Doing the same as before, looking pretty good. And then it got a little bit better, but it wasn't quite able to do the extreme rotation that was going on there. Let's come back. Let's crank our angle up a bit more, 23. Track that forwards again, and you can see this time we've managed to get it looking really nice. Turn that surface on, make sure that's all okay. There we go, just push those out to the edge. There we go, looking good. Excellent. And we'll do a similar sort of thing now with the zoom. Let's bring that up. Turn visibility and processing off on angle and on zoom. Come down to the parameters, turn shear off, and turn the zoom percentage up. Stick it at 14, see what we can do with that. And let's track that one backwards. There we go. You see, by adding that zoom in, we've not quite got it there. Might even need to do an even more crazy zoom. I was even wanting to rotate that in. Let's turn the rotation off here. Bring the zoom even further up. And it's trying. It's really trying. It's not quite got that last little bit. Cool. So let's come in and we'll change this to small motion. We can even bring our search area down a little bit. We don't really need to do that because we've got small motion turned on. But we do want to get rid of these keyframes that we have previously, because it's going to work like we've sort of pre-keyframed this shape, and we haven't done that. Now, quite often it's not necessary. If you want to retrack something with new parameters, just change the parameters and go forward. But I always find it's good practice, if you are going to do that, to just come in and clear those keyframes that you haven't been using before. The easiest way to do that is come over to the left-hand side and open up our dope sheet. And what this now shows us is all of the layers we have. So we can see our zoom, and let's just move along the timeline here. And you see our little bar, which is showing us our current frame and our 2 keyframes prior to this one. We'll just have those selected and hit delete to get rid of them. Cool. Back into parameters again and crank our zoom way up. Let's take that to about 70, 77, even ball. There we go. Cool. And let's just track that forwards, or backwards, I should say. Even though it hasn't done those last couple of frames, at least it isn't moving things out of the way and confusing us. We could easily use adjust track just to manually correct for that drift. But apart from that, that's working quite nicely. And as I said, all of this is keyframeable. So if we look at the first frame, where we set our keyframe, our zoom is set to 77. As we move through, check out the zoom percentage. That's just going down and down and down and down. So what you could do is when you know things are going to be moving a particular way, for example, with the angle and zoom, you can keyframe those up for those particular areas and then bring that back down to 0 afterwards. Cool, so that's the search area there. Let's do the last little bit, just so we can see the difference between shear and perspective. So I've started to get quite a lot of layers in my layer controls. Let's try and just, fix those a bit more and get those whittled down a little bit. So I'm going to add a new group. So just if you come down to the bottom of the layer controls, the little folder, it gives us a new group which we can just put all of the layers in there and work with multiple layers simultaneously. So we can turn the visibility on and off, we can turn processing on and off, we can lock them, and it just looks a little bit neater. So I'll just call this one old. There we go. Let's zoom back to fit and reset our in and out points and find the next bit that we're interested in, which is going to be around about here, frame 260. So set our new in point and reset the out point. Let's just play that a little bit back. So we have 2 objects that are moving in rather different ways. Let's take a look at this one first, and we'll just zoom into our new in and out points. And I will make a new layer using my X spines one more time. And we can turn off the transform, turn off the surface, and just sharpen that up. And moving back down to our parameters, let's take a look at motion. So we've looked at translation, scale, and rotation. Well, let's look now at the difference between shear and perspective, and when you should use one or the other. Well, when we're tracking an object with shear, we're talking about an object that has distortion, but we're talking about the relationship between 2 corners moving. So the go-to example I use for this is always a guy walking down the street wearing a t-shirt, and you see the t-shirt stretching and warping as he moves closer to us and as the torso moves around. Whereas perspective looks at the relationship between all 4 corners of the planar surface. Well, let's just see how that works in practice. Let's take this object here. I'm going to rename this layer shear and just keep all of the parameters at their absolute default and just track that through. And you can see as we do that, it seems to be working absolutely fine. So as the shearing movement builds up, let's just stop that there for a second. It's not going to move anymore. Yeah, as the shearing movement goes along, everything's sitting in absolutely fine. Perfect. Well, let's move our attention over onto the right hand object now. From frame 352, let's set a new project in point and zoom into that so we don't have to worry about this anymore. And we'll turn off visibility and processing on the shear track. But we'll move that into old as well. And let's come now and create a new layer shape around our other object. So pressing and holding Z and panning around with the X key. There we go. Okay, and we will call this one shear 2. Lovely. And I'm going to color code this one for good measure. Let's color code it yellow. Lovely. Now if I just scrub through this, you can see the movement and the motion of this object is slightly different. and we have things moving away from the camera and towards the camera. And again, let's just track this through using the default settings. And sort of making a decent-ish job of it, maybe. Sort of seems to be moving vaguely in line with what we're after. But there's something not quite right. What are we going to do? We're going to check the track itself. So let's turn on our surface. Move that to the corners here. Got nice clean corners, so why don't I use them? Very good point. There we go. Cool. And now as I drag this through again, you can see pretty much immediately, with just shear turned on, it's not able to model that movement properly. So we're slipping, and we're slipping a lot. And so we're not ending up in a particularly great place. So what I'm going to do is I'm just going to make one small change to this. That's it. So let's duplicate this object up. So come over to my layer controls and choose my duplicate layer. And I will call this one perspective. Turn off processing on the shear 2. Make sure perspective is on top. Otherwise it's not going to track properly at all. And I just want to get rid of all of the keyframes we had before. So again, I'm going to pop into my dope sheet and let's have a look at the perspective layer. I can just grab all of these because I don't want any of the old tracking data to inform the new track. I do want to have an object that is exactly the same as the previous one with one exception. And that is turning on perspective down here. Let's turn off the surface and the transform tool for now and just track that one more time. And already you can see that that's moving through a lot better and a lot smoother than it was previously. And let's see how that works with the surface turned on. And that's not slipping anywhere near the way that it did the last time. And the only thing I changed was to make sure that the transform modeling was correct. So the motion was set to perspective because this is a perspective move. And we'll see this a lot when we've got a rigid object with 4 good corners. For example, screens or car number plates or signage, that sort of stuff. I'll turn on my other one there. That is the difference between shear and perspective. Cool, well what we've looked at now in this exercise is we've taken a bigger look at the tracking parameters down here. And it's setting these up correctly that take your good or sometimes just plain lucky tracking results that you get from just using default settings and then letting it go off in itself, to setting these up for the most appropriate settings for your particular object so that you get rock steady, perfect tracking right from the start. But not only have we looked at the parameters here, we've also started to take a bigger look at the layer controls and how we can start to delete, duplicate, and generally organize our layers a bit more. And obviously, this is going to be very important when we start to work with rotoscoping, where there's going to be lots more layers to start taking care of. We've seen too how we can use the controls on our viewer to just isolate smaller bits of a larger clip when we're working on that. And not least, we've taken our first dip into the dope sheet. So we can start to see and control how keyframes are working on our layers. In the next exercise, we're going to be exploring a technique called unlink tracking, which really lets you see the power of Mocha's separation between tracking data and shape data. So I'll see you on the other side.